Marcos grew up on the streets, fighting for survival, until an unexpected encounter with a ruthless billionaire named Gabriel changes everything. Promised wealth and power, Marcos embarks on a journey where success demands impossible sacrifices, and the lines between right and wrong blur. As he rises through a world of high-stakes deals, manipulation, and hard choices, Marcos begins to question the price of his newfound life. Will the dream of success be worth losing himself along the way? Join us as we explore a story of ambition, moral conflict, and the human cost of power. Will Marcos find redemption, or is it too late to turn back? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with all the latest videos. Marcos was no stranger to hardship. Growing up on the streets, surviving each day was a victory in itself. The city, with its towering buildings and expensive cars, was a world apart from his own, a world that never seemed to acknowledge his existence. He spent his days begging for change, finding scraps of food, and doing anything he could to survive. One rainy evening, as Marcos took shelter under a broken bridge, a black limousine pulled up beside him. The sleek vehicle was a stark contrast to the filthy streets he called home. The window rolled down, and a man in a sharp suit leaned out, offering him a cold stare. "Are you Marcos?" the man asked, his voice smooth and calculating. Marcos, confused and wary, nodded. "Yeah, who wants to know?" The man smirked. "I'm Gabriel Andrade. I've been watching you. I see potential in you, Marcos. I can offer you a chance at a life far beyond these streets." The words sounded too good to be true. Marcos had heard it all before. People offering promises of a better life, but in the end, it was always a trap. Still, something in the man's eyes told him this was different. "Why me?" Marcos asked, still skeptical. "Because you're not like the others," Gabriel replied, leaning forward. "You have something most people don't, the will to survive. And that, my friend, is the foundation of true power." Before Marcos could ask more, Gabriel handed him a card. "Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 5th. I'll explain everything." As the limousine drove away, Marcos stood there, the card still in his hand. Was this a trick, or was it a real chance at something bigger? The next day, Marcos found himself standing in front of a cafe on 5th Street, a place he'd never dared to visit before. The shiny windows, the expensive cars parked outside, and the impeccably dressed people walking in and out made him feel out of place. He glanced down at his worn-out clothes and almost turned around. But then he remembered Gabriel's words. "You have potential." With a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The warm air and the scent of freshly brewed coffee hit him immediately. The contrast between the cafe's polished interior and the cold, grimy streets outside felt overwhelming. Gabriel was already there, sitting at a corner table, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Marcos's nervousness. As he saw Marcos approach, a faint smile tugged at the corners of Gabriel's lips. "You came," Gabriel said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Take a seat." Marcos sat down, still unsure what to expect. Gabriel didn't waste time. He slid a folder across the table to Marcos. "Inside this folder is the first of many challenges I will give you. It's not about your past, it's about what you're willing to do to change your future." Marcos opened the folder, revealing a detailed document filled with business terminology he couldn't fully understand. His stomach tightened with uncertainty, but Gabriel was watching him closely, waiting. "You have two options," Gabriel continued. "You can walk away right now, go back to the streets, and forget this ever happened. Or you can accept the challenge. It will be hard, Marcos, but if you succeed, you'll have a life that most people could never even dream of." The weight of the decision pressed down on Marcos. He had nothing left, no family, no friends, just the cold streets and endless struggle. But this was a real chance, wasn't it? "I'll do it," Marcos said, his voice steady despite the doubts swirling in his mind. Gabriel nodded, his eyes glinting with approval. "Good. Your first task starts today." The folder Gabriel had given Marcos wasn't just filled with business jargon, it was an overwhelming sea of numbers, strategies, and charts. It seemed like a different language altogether. Marcos sat in the cafe, trying to make sense of it, but the words blurred together. Words like ROI, capital allocation, and market penetration meant nothing to him. He had never been exposed to anything like this before. His mind raced as he stared at the document, wondering if he had made the right choice. The street had been his world. The rules were simple, but here, in this new reality, everything was a puzzle, and he wasn't sure if he had the pieces to solve it. As hours passed, Gabriel didn't check in. He was letting Marcos figure things out on his own, a move that both frustrated and intrigued him. Marcos knew he couldn't back out now. This was his shot. His only shot. After some time, Marcos made a decision. Instead of getting overwhelmed, he would approach this like any problem on the streets. Find the simplest solution. The document wasn't just a maze of terms. It was a map to a way out. He flipped through the pages, ignoring the complexity, and focused on the most obvious question: how could he make money? He started scribbling down ideas, simple concepts he understood: who would buy, how much they'd pay, and where he could sell. His strategy wasn't the most sophisticated, but it was honest, based on practicality and survival. Marcos wasn't trying to become a CEO overnight. He just wanted a way to get ahead. Hours later, Gabriel returned, his presence filling the space. He sat down, eyes scanning the paper that Marcos had hastily filled with his thoughts. "You took your time," Gabriel said, leaning back in his chair. "But tell me, what did you learn?" Marcos, still unsure if he had done it right, explained his approach. Simple, pragmatic, focused on immediate returns. Gabriel listened intently, his expression unreadable. "You see," Gabriel said after a long pause, "you've got a natural instinct. Not all of this business is about theory. It's about seeing the bigger picture in the simplest form. You're thinking in a way most people never learn to." Marcos didn't feel like he had won, but there was a flicker of something, validation maybe. Gabriel was impressed, but that was only the beginning. "You've passed your first challenge," Gabriel said with a slight nod. "But now the real test begins. You can't just think like a survivor, you have to think like a winner." Gabriel's praise was short-lived. As Marcos made his way through the following days, the weight of the challenge began to sink in. The first success had been a confidence boost, but Gabriel wasn't one to let anyone rest on their laurels. The tasks grew more difficult, and the pressure was building. Marcos found himself constantly grappling with the lessons Gabriel had imparted, trying to balance his survival instincts with the world of high-stakes business. It wasn't easy. The promises of wealth and success were like a mirage, always shifting and never fully within reach. One evening, Gabriel called him to meet at a new location, a high-rise building with glass walls that overlooked the city skyline. The view was breathtaking, but it didn't bring Marcos peace. It felt like the beginning of something far more dangerous than what he'd imagined. "Tonight, we're going to take things to the next level," Gabriel said, as they sat across from each other in a luxurious conference room. The walls were adorned with sleek, modern art, and a massive table stretched between them. Marcos felt uneasy. There was something in Gabriel's eyes that wasn't there before, a kind of cold detachment, as if he were about to test him in a way he hadn't yet experienced. "I've arranged for you to meet one of the most powerful men in the city," Gabriel continued. "A man who plays by no rules but his own. If you want to succeed in this world, Marcos, you have to learn to deal with people like him." Marcos listened, trying to mask the rising sense of dread. He had learned that success in Gabriel's world came with compromises, but this felt different. There was something predatory in Gabriel's tone, something that made Marcos question the path he was on. The meeting was set. When they entered the room, the man Gabriel introduced was an intimidating figure, tall, with a chiseled face and eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. His reputation preceded him, ruthless, manipulative, and always getting what he wanted. "Marcos," Gabriel said, his voice firm. "Meet Victor Alves. He's the kind of man who can make you a millionaire or destroy you without a second thought." Victor extended his hand, his grip cold and calculating. "So you're the one who thinks he's got what it takes, huh? We'll see about that." The tension in the room was thick. Gabriel stepped back, allowing the two men to size each other up. Marcos could feel the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about business, it was about survival. "Tell me," Victor said, his voice smooth as silk, "how far are you willing to go to win, Marcos? Because in this world, there's always a price, and it's never cheap." The question hung in the air, and for the first time since he'd met Gabriel, Marcos felt unsure. What had he gotten himself into? The night stretched on, and Marcos felt the weight of Victor's gaze, like a 1,000-pound anchor dragging him down. Gabriel remained silent, watching the scene unfold with an almost clinical detachment. Marcos could feel the tension in the room tightening with each passing second. Victor was a man of few words, but his presence was more powerful than any speech. His reputation wasn't built on kindness, it was forged in the fire of ruthless decisions, backstabbing, and the cold, unrelenting pursuit of power. Marcos had faced tough situations in his life, but this was different. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about choices that would shape the rest of his life. Victor finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You think you're ready to play in the big leagues?" he asked, his smile cold and calculated. "Let me tell you something. Success doesn't come without sacrifice. It's not just about making the right moves. It's about knowing when to make the wrong ones." Marcos swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if Victor was trying to intimidate him or teach him a lesson, but it was clear that the stakes were much higher than he had anticipated. Gabriel leaned forward, his tone now shifting to something more urgent. "You've done well so far, Marcos, but you're not going to make it in this world unless you learn to make sacrifices. And I don't mean just a little compromise here and there. I mean real sacrifices, ones that could cost you more than you're willing to give." The words stung, but they weren't surprising. Marcos had already sensed that this world wasn't one where loyalty or morality had any place. It was about power, and Gabriel had made it clear that the price of success in this world was steep. Victor's eyes locked onto Marcos's, unblinking as if waiting for him to flinch. "You've got potential, kid," he said, his voice low. "But you're still too soft. If you want to be like us, you've got to be willing to do what others won't. No hesitation, no second thoughts." Marcos stood there, paralyzed by the reality of what he was being asked to become. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to walk away, to reject everything Gabriel and Victor represented. But then, he thought about the life he had left behind, the streets, the hunger, the endless struggle. He thought about how far he'd come, how much he had already sacrificed. "How far are you willing to go?" Gabriel's voice broke through his thoughts, as if he had been reading his mind. "What is the price you're willing to pay for the life you've always wanted?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcos had already made his choice when he stepped into Gabriel's world. But now, standing in front of two men who had crossed lines he hadn't even known existed, the true cost of that choice was beginning to unfold before him. Marcos knew that if he wanted to succeed, he would have to do things he never imagined. But could he? Could he become the man Gabriel and Victor wanted him to be? As he stood there, staring at them both, Marcos realized that the price of power wasn't just money. It was his very soul. The days after his meeting with Victor and Gabriel felt like a blur. Marcos couldn't shake the words they had said to him. Each passing moment seemed to pull him further into a world he didn't fully understand, but was rapidly becoming a part of. The rules had shifted, and with them, his perception of right and wrong began to warp. He threw himself into the next challenge Gabriel set before him, a high-stakes negotiation. Marcos was to meet with a wealthy investor who controlled a major company that could potentially make him millions. But there was a catch. This wasn't going to be a simple transaction. The investor was known for his ruthlessness and was infamous for securing deals that left others destroyed in the process. "Remember, Marcos," Gabriel had said before the meeting, "this isn't about being liked. This is about winning. You're not here to make friends. You're here to take what's yours." Marcos tried to focus, but a voice in the back of his mind kept questioning everything. He had crossed lines already, doing things he never thought he would, but the deeper he got, the more the weight of those choices started to crush him. The meeting took place in a sleek, modern office high above the city. The investor, a tall, imposing man with a sharp suit and piercing gaze, greeted Marcos with a barely there smile. His confidence oozed, and as they sat down across from each other, Marcos couldn't help but feel small. "Let's get straight to the point, shall we?" the investor said, his voice low and commanding. "I've heard about you, Marcos. They say you're the next big thing, but I have my doubts." Marcos clenched his fists under the table, feeling the pressure building in his chest. The words hit harder than he expected. This man didn't see him as a person. He saw him as a project, an object to manipulate and control. And yet, despite the discomfort in his gut, Marcos pushed through. He had learned that this was the game. He had to play it, no matter how much it cost him. The negotiation continued, with each side pushing harder and harder, testing limits, throwing out proposals that seemed to get more extreme by the second. Marcos knew the stakes. If he succeeded, it would secure his place in this world. If he failed, he would be nothing. As the meeting progressed, Marcos began to feel a strange, hollow sensation. His instincts, which had always guided him through tough situations, now felt off. The words he was saying didn't feel like his own anymore. They were words he had learned from Gabriel and Victor, phrases designed to manipulate, to conquer, to win at all costs. When the investor finally leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his lips, Marcos knew that he had crossed the line. They had agreed on the terms, a deal that would make him incredibly rich, but at what cost? As he walked out of the building, the weight of the deal pressing heavily on his chest, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. He had done it. He had won. But had he lost something far more important in the process? Gabriel was waiting outside as if he had expected this moment. "Well done," he said, his eyes glinting with approval. "You've passed another test." Whom? But as Marcos stood there looking at Gabriel, he realized that winning wasn't everything. The cost of his ambition was starting to become clear. It was taking more from him than he was willing to give. Marcos couldn't sleep. The deal he had struck with the investor weighed on his mind, a constant reminder that he was no longer the same person he had been just a few weeks ago. The money, the power, the influence, everything was within reach. But something inside him was unraveling, something he couldn't ignore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the people he had left behind, the memories of the streets, the survival instincts that had once defined him, seemed so distant now. In their place was a new set of rules, rules that demanded sacrifices and compromises that went against everything he had once stood for. Gabriel's teachings had been clear. To succeed in this world, you had to do things no one else was willing to. But as Marcos sat in his luxury apartment, staring out at the city that had once seemed so unreachable, he felt a void inside him. The world that had seemed so shiny and promising now felt empty. Victor had been right. Power came with a price, and Marcos was starting to see what that price truly meant. The people he had crossed, the deals he had made, the promises he had broken, they were all starting to catch up with him. Gabriel had noticed the change in Marcos. The once enthusiastic young man had grown distant, withdrawn. He wasn't the same firebrand who had walked into the cafe that first day. Something in him had shifted, and Gabriel knew it. "You're thinking too much," Gabriel said one evening when they met at a private lounge. "You're letting your emotions get in the way of your success." Marcos wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He had no defense. His thoughts had become a whirlwind of doubt, regret, and fear. Fear that he was losing himself in the pursuit of something he didn't even know if he wanted anymore. "I've made my decisions," Marcos said quietly, his voice hollow. "But what happens when you've crossed every line? When there's no one left to trust, no one left to care for?" Gabriel's face softened for the first time. "You can't afford to care about that, Marcos. The moment you start caring about the people around you, that's when you lose. This world doesn't work on kindness, it works on power. And in this game, the only person you can trust is yourself." But Marcos wasn't sure anymore. The weight of his actions was starting to suffocate him. The faces of those he had hurt, the lives he had destroyed, were all coming back to haunt him. In his mind, he could hear their voices pleading with him, reminding him of who he had been. As the days passed, he found it harder to focus, harder to breathe. The life he had once dreamed of was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of money or success could fill the emptiness inside. He had become someone he barely recognized, someone driven by ambition, but at the cost of his soul. It was then that Marcos realized the truth. He had been chasing the wrong dream. The power, the wealth, the influence, none of it mattered if he lost himself in the process. The price had been higher than he had ever imagined. As Gabriel's voice echoed in his mind, Marcos knew he had a choice to make. Could he turn back? Could he salvage the pieces of himself that remained? Or was he too far gone to ever return to who he had been? Marcos stood at a crossroads. The world around him had become a blur, a dizzying swirl of opportunities, temptations, and consequences. The life he had built, one forged through cold deals, ruthless decisions, and the sacrifices of everything he once held dear, felt like a fragile house of cards. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. Gabriel had warned him that this would happen. "You can't climb to the top without losing yourself," he had said. But what Gabriel hadn't prepared him for was how much that loss would hurt. Power, money, and influence were hollow when you were left with nothing but emptiness inside. Marcos had climbed so high, but now he could see the true cost of the journey. He had lost the very things that had once made him human: empathy, compassion, and a sense of purpose. It was in the quiet of the early morning that Marcos made a decision. He stood at the window of his apartment, the city lights twinkling like 1,000 stars that seemed so far out of reach. The life he had once dreamed of freedom, success, and recognition, now felt meaningless. He had everything he thought he wanted, but nothing that truly mattered. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Gabriel. "Are you ready?" Gabriel's voice was cold, professional. There was no warmth, no concern. It was the voice of a man who had seen it all and believed that nothing mattered except the deal. "The investor wants to finalize everything today. It's your big moment." Marcos's hand hovered over the phone. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, walking away from the world Gabriel had introduced him to. But the pull was strong, the promise of unimaginable wealth, the power that came with it, and the fear that he would never have another chance like this again. But then, something shifted. He remembered the people he had left behind, the community he had once been a part of, the friends who had trusted him, the ones who had looked up to him. He remembered the man he had once been before Gabriel and Victor had twisted him into something else. "Gabriel," Marcos said, his voice steady but tinged with a sense of finality. "I'm done." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean you're done?" Gabriel's voice was a mix of confusion and disbelief. "I'm walking away," Marcos said. "I'm leaving all of this behind." For the first time since their partnership began, Marcos heard a slight crack in Gabriel's composed demeanor. "You're making a mistake, Marcos. You've come too far. You can't just throw it all away." "I know exactly what I'm throwing away," Marcos replied, "but I'm not throwing away who I am. Not anymore." The line went silent, and for a moment, Marcos thought Gabriel might hang up. But then he heard a sigh, a soft, almost resigned sound. "You've got guts, kid, but don't come crawling back when you realize how hard life really is." Marcos ended the call without saying another word. As he stood there, looking out at the city one last time, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't in a while: peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was done being a pawn in a game that had never been his own. He was going to reclaim his life. And with that, Marcos stepped away from the window, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The man he had been before had been lost to ambition, but now he was finding his way back, one step at a time.